The massive alien creature appeared in the middle of the United Nations meeting room, like something from a nightmare. Velthar stood 12 feet tall, its body made of living crystal that caught the room's lights and threw them back in sharp, angry colors. Every surface of its form seemed to cut through the air itself, and when it spoke, the sound came from everywhere at once. Admiral Hannah Kim felt her jaw clench as the translation devices around the room crackled to life. She had been preparing for this moment for months, ever since the first reports came in about alien ships gathering at the edge of their solar system. Now, standing at the podium in her crisp Navy uniform, she could feel the weight of every human, life pressing down on her shoulders. "People of Earth," Velthar's voice boomed through the chamber, each word carefully chosen to sound like a judge delivering a death sentence. "The Galactic Council has reached its final decision regarding your species. You have exactly 72 hours to surrender every weapon, every ship, every means of defense you possess." Behind Admiral Kim, President Jun-Ho Park sat frozen at the main table. His face showed nothing, but she could see his hands gripping, the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles had turned white. Around the massive circular room, representatives from every nation on Earth sat in stunned silence. Some looked terrified, others angry, but all of them looked to her for answers she wasn't sure she had. The alien continued its speech with the casual tone of someone ordering coffee. 47 different alien races have studied your kind for the past 50 years. We have watched you expand from your small blue world to 3 different star systems. We have seen how you fight each other, how you destroy your own planet, how you solve every problem with violence. The verdict is clear. Humans are too dangerous to be left alone in the galaxy. Velthar's crystal form shifted slightly, and the light patterns dancing across its surface seemed to pulse with each word. Your choice is simple. Submit to what we call protective custody, and your species will survive under our guidance. Refuse, and we will remove the threat you represent to civilized space. 10,000 of our finest warships wait just beyond your outer planet. Your entire military consists of barely 200 vessels. In the back row of the assembly, Colonel Minho Lee sat next to Dr. Sola Choi, both of them trying to look as unremarkable as possible. Lee was Earth's top military planner, a man who had spent his entire career studying how to win impossible wars. Next to him, Dr. Choi appeared to be just another scientist in a simple grey suit, but she knew more about alien biology than anyone else on the planet. They had been working together in secret for over a decade, ever since the first peaceful contact with alien species. While diplomats shook hands and signed treaties, Lee and Choi had been asking different questions. What did these aliens fear? How did they think? What would happen if friendship turned to war? Now, as Velthar delivered humanity's death sentence, both of them felt a cold satisfaction. The aliens had made the same mistake that every enemy in human history had made. They had confused the size of the army with the will to fight. Dr. Choi caught Colonel Lee's eye and gave the smallest possible nod. In that tiny gesture, years of preparation clicked into place. The aliens thought they knew everything about humans, from watching their wars and studying their history. But they had missed the most important lesson of all. Humans didn't just fight to win. They fought to make sure their enemies regretted ever picking the fight in the first place. Sometimes they won, sometimes they lost, but they always made the other side pay a price that would be remembered for generations. The crystal. Alien finished its ultimatum and began to fade away, confident that fear would do the rest of its work. As the last traces of Velthar disappeared, Admiral Kim finally spoke into the deadly silence that filled the room. 72 hours, she said quietly. I suggest we make them count. Far across the galaxy, in a gleaming command center that looked more like a crystal cathedral than a military base, strategic analyst Keung-ha studied the human data files with the satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered his prey. The aliens' 4 eyes moved independently as they scanned through decades of human behavior patterns, each report confirming what the Galactic Council already believed. Humans were nothing special. They fought like animals, destroyed their own environment, and crumbled the moment they faced overwhelming force. Keung-ha had seen it happen to dozens of other primitive species. First came the shock of realizing they weren't alone in the universe, then panic as they understood how outmatched they were. Finally, surrender as their leaders chose survival over pride. The analyst's tentacles clicked against his workstation as he pulled up the final calculations. Based on every psychological profile they had built, humans would last maybe 6 hours after the first demonstration of council power, probably less. Their entire military was laughably small compared to the 10,000-ship armada waiting at the edge of their solar system. But while Kyung-ha studied his reports in comfort, something very different was happening throughout human space. Every military base on Earth went silent at exactly the same moment. Space stations stopped transmitting. Colony worlds that had been chattering with radio signals for decades suddenly became as quiet as empty rocks floating in space. In her command bunker buried 3 miles beneath Seoul, Admiral Hana Kim placed her hand on a scanner that had been waiting for this moment for 20 years. The device read her palm print, her retinal pattern, and her DNA signature before finally accepting her identity. A single word appeared on the screen in front of her: Lazarus. She pressed the activation button, and across human space, a plan that had been decades in the making finally began to unfold. Protocol Lazarus wasn't named after the biblical figure who rose from the dead by accident. It was named after him because sometimes the only way to win is to make your enemy think you're already defeated. Captain Ji-won Nam felt the slight vibration through her fighter's hull as the activation signal reached her ship. She was floating in the absolute darkness beyond Jupiter, her vessel running on such minimal power that it barely registered as anything more than space debris. Her life support was turned down so low that her breath came out in visible puffs, but she had been trained for this. Around her, scattered throughout the outer solar system, thousands of other pilots received the same signal. They had been waiting for days in the cold emptiness of space, living on emergency rations and sustained by nothing but anger and duty. Each of them had volunteered, knowing they probably wouldn't be coming home. Military planners had a polite name for what they were about to do: one-way intercept missions. The pilots themselves called it something simpler: making the aliens regret they were ever born. Dr. Sola Choi sat in her underground laboratory, surrounded by files that represented 20 years of careful work. While diplomats had been shaking hands with alien visitors and signing peace treaties, she had been asking different questions. What made each species afraid? How did their minds work? What would happen if they stopped being friends and became enemies? Her team had studied every alien species in the Galactic Council, learning their biology, their psychology, and most importantly, their weaknesses. They had done it all under the cover of peaceful scientific cooperation, attending conferences and sharing research. The aliens had been happy to teach humans about their cultures and biology, never suspecting that every piece of information was being carefully catalogued for potential military use. Now, as the countdown to war began, all that knowledge would serve a much darker purpose. The Council thought they knew everything about human nature, from watching their wars and studying their history. But they had made one critical error in their analysis. They had never faced an enemy that considered mutual destruction a perfectly acceptable outcome. When the 72-hour deadline finally ran out, the alien fleet began moving toward Earth like a slow-motion avalanche of metal and energy. 1,000 Council warships advanced in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the confidence of a civilization that had never lost a war. Each vessel was the size of a small city, bristling with weapons that could crack planets in half. Admiral Velthar stood on the bridge of the lead ship, watching Earth grow larger on his viewing screens. In his crystalline mind, this would be over quickly. The humans would fire a few desperate shots, realize how hopeless their situation was, and then surrender. It was the same pattern he had seen dozens of times before when the Council absorbed primitive species into their empire. But Captain Ji-won Nam had been waiting in the darkness for 4 days, and she was done being patient. Her fighter had been drifting silent beyond Jupiter's shadow, its systems powered down so low that it registered as nothing more than space junk on any scanner. She had been living on protein bars and recycled water, breathing air so cold it hurt her lungs, all while staring at the same stars through her cockpit window. But when the Council fleet finally moved into range, every hour of discomfort transformed into pure, focused hatred. The Korean characters, painted on her ship's hull, Jugumul Gyokara, meant remember death. It was the last thing the alien admiral would ever see. Nam's fighter erupted from the void like a bullet, fired from the darkness itself, its nuclear warhead primed to detonate on impact. Around her, hundreds of other pilots emerged from hiding spots throughout the solar system, each one screaming, toward the alien formation at maximum speed. Their ships had been stripped down to nothing but engines, weapons, and life support. They weren't built to return home. The Council ships barely had time to register the incoming threats before Nam's fighter punched through the flagship's shields and detonated against its bridge in a ball of white-hot nuclear fire. The explosion tore through the command section like a miniature sun, vaporizing everything within a half-mile radius. Admiral Velthar died without understanding what had killed him. Behind Nam, wave after wave of human fighters followed her example. They sang old Korean war songs over their radio channels as they dove toward their targets, their voices echoing across space in a dozen different languages. Some pilots recited prayers, others shouted curses, but all of them drove their ships straight into alien hulls without hesitation. Admiral Hannah Kim watched the battle unfold from her command bunker 3 miles beneath Seoul. The tactical display showed her pilots as small red dots racing toward much larger blue squares, representing Council ships. Each time a red dot touched a blue square, both disappeared from the screen. In the first hour alone, 300 alien vessels died, taking their human attackers with them. The exchange rate was exactly what Kim had planned for. Every human fighter was taking out at least one Council ship, and many were managing to destroy 2 or 3 before their luck ran out. It was a trade that heavily favored Earth, since the aliens had brought 10 times as many ships, but couldn't replace their losses nearly as easily as humans could replace pilots. Commander Taijo Song led the second phase of the attack, his voice crackling over the radio with calm professionalism, even as explosions lit up space around him. Primary targets eliminated, he reported to Kim, beginning harassment protocols. His squadron had somehow survived the initial kamikaze assault, and now their job was to hunt the surviving Council ships like wolves stalking wounded prey. Song's fighters darted in and out of the alien formation, striking from unexpected angles before disappearing back into the darkness. They used the debris from destroyed ships as cover, emerging just long enough to fire their weapons before vanishing again. The Council fleet, which had advanced in perfect military formation just an hour earlier, was now scattered across millions of cubic miles of space, their captains screaming contradictory orders at each other. For the first time in their 1,000-year history, the Galactic Council was learning what it felt like to be afraid. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter had always looked empty to alien scouts flying through the region. For decades, they had filed reports describing small human mining operations scattered across dozens of rocky worlds, nothing more threatening than automated equipment pulling metals from stone. The Council had barely bothered to catalogue these installations, dismissing them as the primitive industrial efforts of a young species. Chief Engineer Dai Ho Kang smiled grimly as he watched those same scouts scramble in panic. He had spent the last 15 years of his life turning every piece of floating rock in the solar system into a weapons factory, and now his life's work was about to reveal itself to the galaxy. On Ceres, the largest asteroid in the belt, massive. Metal doors that had been disguised as mining shafts suddenly burst open. What emerged wasn't ore or processed metals. It was death itself, shaped into millions of small deadly packages. The Terran wasp drones poured out like angry insects from a disturbed nest, each one no bigger than a motorcycle but packed with enough explosive power to gut a Council warship. Europa, Jupiter's ice-covered moon, split open along hidden seams that had been carefully carved beneath its frozen surface. The installations there had been producing drones for over a decade, using the moon's vast underground oceans as cover for the biggest manufacturing operation in human history. Millions more wasps erupted from the ice, their black hulls absorbing starlight as they formed into attack formations. From dozens of other asteroids throughout the system, similar swarms emerged, Each installation had been carefully hidden, disguised as routine mining operations while actually producing the components for humanity's ultimate weapon. The aliens had been watching Earth's colonies for years, never realizing they were looking at the largest weapons manufacturing network ever created. The swarms moved with intelligence that made the Council's military analysts break into cold sweats. These weren't simple automatic weapons firing blindly at targets. They were coordinated through quantum communication links that allowed millions of individual drones to act as a single, terrifyingly efficient organism. They flowed around Council, defensive formations like water finding cracks in a dam, always striking at the weakest points. Admiral Hana Kim's voice broadcast across every radio frequency in the solar system as the drones began their work. "You wanted to see human brutality in action," she said, her words carrying the weight of centuries of human warfare. "Now watch how we took everything we learned from killing each other and turned it into an art form." On the bridge of the Council's surviving flagship, strategic analyst Kyung-ha stared at his tactical displays in absolute horror. The numbers scrolling across his screens made no sense according to everything he knew about civilized warfare. The humans were losing 10 drones for every Council ship they destroyed, but they seemed to have an endless supply of drones. His computers estimated that at least 50 million of the devices were already active, with more emerging from hidden facilities every minute. Lieutenant Yuna Hong sat in a control room, buried deep beneath the surface of Earth's moon, her hands moving across holographic displays that showed the position of every drone in the swarm. She had spent years studying the bloodiest battles in human history, from ancient Greek warfare to the massive tank battles of World War II, learning how to coordinate large numbers of individual units into overwhelming force. The drones responded to her commands like they were extensions of her own body. She could make them flow around enemy formations like schools of metal fish, converge on single targets like hunting wolves, or spread out to attack multiple ships simultaneously. Each group operated with its own tactical intelligence, while still following her overall strategy. The Council fleet, which had been confident just hours earlier, now found itself surrounded by an enemy they couldn't understand. They were fighting not just against individual ships or even human pilots, but against what seemed like a single vast intelligence that treated their weapons and soldiers as disposable cells in a larger organism. For the first time in their civilized existence, the aliens began to understand that they weren't fighting a species. They were fighting evolution itself, weaponized and turned against them. Dr. Sola Choi sat in her underground laboratory, surrounded by 20 years of research that was about to become the most devastating weapon humanity had ever unleashed. For decades, she had attended alien cultural exchanges, scientific conferences, and diplomatic meetings, always asking innocent questions about biology, psychology, and social behavior. The aliens had been eager to share their knowledge with the curious humans, never suspecting that every answer was being catalogued for a much darker purpose. Now, as the Council fleet reeled from the drone attacks, it was time to show them what humans had really learned during all those friendly conversations. Specialist Byom Ko worked frantically at his computer terminal, his fingers flying across holographic keyboards as he prepared to launch the most sophisticated cyber attack in galactic history. His team of hackers had spent years studying Council communication networks, learning how each alien species processed information and what kind of data could overwhelm their neural systems. The first wave of attacks targeted the crystalline beings. Like the late Admiral Velthar, Ko's programs flooded their ship's communication systems with images of shattering crystal formations and audio files of grinding, scraping sounds. To human ears, the sounds were merely annoying, but to beings whose bodies were made of living crystal, the frequencies caused their molecular structures to vibrate in painful resonance. Across the Council fleet, crystalline officers began literally cracking apart at their workstations, their bodies unable to withstand the sonic assault. The bat-like Pateran species, who relied on echolocation and sensitive hearing, found their communication channels filled with ultrasonic frequencies that drove them into complete madness. Their ships began spinning wildly through space as their pilots clawed at their own ears, desperate to escape sounds that felt like ice picks being driven into their brains. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the attacks on the insectoid hive minds. These species shared a collective consciousness that allowed thousands of individuals to think as one. Coe's team had created artificial pheromone patterns that, when transmitted as digital data, caused their shared mental network to collapse into chaos. Individual insects began attacking their own hive mates, their collective intelligence fragmenting into millions of confused, terrified minds. Dr. Choi activated the fleet-wide communication system, her voice reaching every surviving council ship. Every diplomatic meeting was reconnaissance, she announced calmly. Every scientific exchange was intelligence gathering. Every cultural celebration where you shared your traditions with us was actually us learning how to destroy you. You showed us your art, your music, your literature, and we studied it all to find your weaknesses. Captain In-ho Park coordinated the psychological warfare assault from a bunker buried so deep beneath Earth's surface that it could survive a direct nuclear strike. His teams had worked for years to create custom-designed mental weapons for each of the 47 species in the Galactic Council. They had studied alien mythology to find their deepest fears, analyzed their brain chemistry to discover what could drive them insane, and mapped their social structures to understand how to make them turn against each other. The weapons spread through Council computer networks like digital viruses, each one specifically engineered to exploit the unique psychological vulnerabilities of its target species. Some aliens were driven to panic by images of their greatest predators. Others were paralyzed by sounds that triggered ancient evolutionary fears. The most sophisticated attacks manipulated their brain chemistry directly, flooding their systems with artificial hormones that caused overwhelming terror or rage. The results were immediate and devastating. The Council's perfectly coordinated fleet began tearing itself apart, as species that had been allies for centuries suddenly saw each other as mortal enemies. Some groups fled the battlefield entirely, their ships jumping to hyperspace in blind panic. Others turned their weapons on their former allies, their rational minds consumed by artificially triggered hatred. Admiral Hannah Kim watched the chaos unfold from her command center, her expression grim but satisfied. The tactical displays showed Council formations dissolving into random clusters of ships firing at each other. What had started as a coordinated invasion force was rapidly becoming a free-for-all battle between species that could no longer trust their own senses. "This is the difference between us," Kim broadcast to the surviving Council commanders. "Humanity has been perfecting the art of war for thousands of years. You've only been practicing it. We learned how to fight by fighting ourselves, and now we're teaching you lessons written in our own blood." The galaxy's most civilized species were discovering that sometimes the monsters really do win. While the Council fleet burned in Earth's solar system, Colonel Jinwoo Ro was already light years away, standing in the shadows of an alien city that had never seen war. For the past 3 years, he and his team had been quietly infiltrating Council space, using captured alien technology, learning the layouts of their most important worlds, and preparing for a mission that would redefine the meaning of terror. Fees. 3 of Protocol Lazarus wasn't about defending Earth. It was about making sure the aliens understood that distance meant nothing to human revenge. Ro's team had spent months studying the crystalline homeworld of Velthar's species, mapping the locations of their government buildings, power plants, and population centers. The aliens had built their cities like living works of art, with towers of pure crystal that caught and reflected their sun's light in beautiful rainbow patterns. It was magnificent, peaceful, and completely defenseless against the kind of warfare humans had perfected over centuries of killing each other. Major Sujin Yu crouched behind a crystal formation on the outskirts of the capital city, watching her team's demolition experts place charges at key structural points. The aliens had never needed to worry about terrorism or sabotage. Their civilization was too advanced for such primitive concerns. That overconfidence was about to cost them everything. At exactly the same moment, across 12 different worlds, scattered throughout Council space, human strike teams activated their weapons. The attacks had been coordinated down to the second, timed so that every Council capital would experience the same horror simultaneously. There would be no time for warnings, no chance to evacuate, and no possibility of defense. Use explosives. Turn the crystal city into a storm of glittering death. The carefully placed charges caused a chain reaction that propagated through the crystalline structures like cracks spreading through ice. Entire districts collapsed in cascades of rainbow-colored destruction, crushing millions of aliens who had never imagined that war could reach their peaceful world. The beautiful spires that had stood for thousands of years became weapons themselves, their fragments raining down like deadly hail. Colonel Rowe's voice crackled across communication channels throughout Council space as he led his team through the burning ruins of the Galactic Council's central headquarters. "Earth may burn," he transmitted, his words reaching every surviving alien leader. "But every one of your worlds will share our fate. You wanted to judge humanity. Here's your verdict. Each human death demands payment of 1,000 alien lives." The psychological impact of the attacks was even more devastating than the physical destruction. For millennia, the Council species had lived in perfect safety, protected by vast distances and diplomatic immunity. Their homeworlds were supposed to be sanctuaries, places where war was just a historical curiosity studied by academics. The sudden realization that human weapons could reach anywhere in the galaxy shattered their sense of security, more completely than any military defeat. On the Council's archive world, Sergeant Narration led her demolition team through corridors lined with the accumulated knowledge of 47 different civilizations, libraries that contained millions of years of scientific discoveries, historical records, and cultural achievements, stretched out in every direction. It was irreplaceable, priceless, and exactly the kind of target that would make the aliens understand what they were really fighting. Shin placed her final explosive charge against the central data core, a crystalline structure that housed the collective memory of galactic civilization. Her team had already destroyed backup facilities on 6 other worlds. This was the last repository of Council knowledge in the galaxy. As she activated the timer, her final transmission was broadcast to every surviving alien leader. Primitives. Learn by destroying things. We've had a lot of practice, so we're excellent students. The explosion erased thousands of years of accumulated wisdom in a single, blinding flash. Scientific discoveries that had taken generations to achieve, historical records that chronicled the rise of interstellar civilization, artistic masterpieces that represented the finest achievements of dozens of species, all of it became radioactive. Ash in seconds. Across the galaxy, Council leaders huddled in underground bunkers on their devastated worlds, finally understanding the true nature of their enemy. Humanity wasn't just fighting a war for survival. They were waging a campaign of extinction that would leave scars on galactic civilization for millions of years to come. The aliens had wanted to judge whether humans were too dangerous to exist freely in the galaxy. Now they had their answer, written in the ashes of their own worlds. Dr. Solar Choi stood in her sterile underground laboratory, surrounded by equipment that had cost more than most countries' military budgets. For 23 years, she had been the galaxy's leading expert on alien biology, invited to every scientific conference and research symposium across Council space. The aliens had welcomed her enthusiasm for learning about their unique physiologies, never suspecting that every tissue sample, every genetic sequence, every biological detail she studied was being filed away for a very different purpose. Now, as the war reached its most desperate phase, those decades of research were about to become the most devastating weapons in human history. The first biological agent was designed specifically for the crystalline beings like the late Admiral Velthar. Choi had discovered that their silicon-based bodies relied on a delicate molecular structure that could be disrupted by engineered viruses. The weapons spread through their ship's air systems like a digital plague, causing their bodies to develop microscopic cracks that spread rapidly through their crystalline matrices. Within hours, entire crews were shattering like glass sculptures dropped on concrete floors. The methane-breathing titans presented a different challenge. These massive aliens lived in ships filled with poisonous gas, their biology perfectly adapted to an environment that would kill most other species instantly. But Choi had learned that they relied on specialized bacteria in their atmospheric processes to maintain the chemical balance they needed to survive. Her engineered plague consumed these bacteria with terrifying efficiency, leaving the Titans to suffocate slowly in their own ships as their breathing systems failed one by one. Perhaps most disturbing were the weapons designed for the energy-based luminols. These beings existed as pure consciousness within containment fields, their thoughts and memories encoded in complex quantum patterns. Choi's quantum viruses attacked those patterns directly, corrupting their very essence and causing their minds to dissolve into chaotic static. They died not from physical injury, but from the destruction of their souls themselves. Dr. Choi activated her laboratory's communication system, broadcasting on all council frequencies as her weapons spread through the alien fleet. "You called as primitive savages," she said, her voice calm and professional as if she were delivering a scientific lecture. "But primitives survive by adapting to their environment. We have adapted to kill each of you in ways your civilized minds never imagined possible." Captain Moon-hee Lim watched the biological warfare deployment from her stealth ship, positioned at the edge of the battlefield. Her screens showed council formations that had been perfectly organized just hours earlier, now drifting through space as lifeless hulks. The weapons were working with surgical precision. Each species faced a form of extinction specifically tailored to their unique biology, while leaving their ships and technology intact for human forces to salvage later. The beauty of the biological weapons wasn't just their lethality, it was their elegance. Humanity had taken everything that made each council species successful and turned it into a weakness. The crystalline being's perfect molecular structure became brittle and fragile. The Titan's specialized atmospheric requirements became a chokehold. The Luminal's advanced consciousness became a target for digital corruption. Research assistant Garam Bey sat at his workstation, documenting the weapon's effectiveness with the clinical detachment of a scientist recording experimental results. His reports, automatically broadcast to all surviving council ships, read like horror stories written in scientific language. Species that had dominated the galaxy for thousands of years were being reduced to genetic chaos within hours of exposure to human biological weapons. Subject Group 7 Alpha shows complete cellular breakdown at the 4.3-hour mark, Bey reported in his steady, emotionless voice. Subject Group 12 Beta exhibits systematic nervous system failure beginning at exposure plus 2.1 hours. Recommend immediate quarantine protocols for any surviving members of these species classifications. The most terrifying aspect of his reports wasn't the death tolls. It was the fact that humans had clearly been planning this for decades. Every biological weapon was too sophisticated, too precisely targeted to have been developed during the Tuai current conflict. The aliens were realizing that humanity had been preparing to exterminate them since the very first peaceful contact between their species. Across the surviving council fleet, alien commanders began to understand that they weren't fighting against simple military aggression. They were facing a species that had weaponized evolution itself, turning the fundamental building blocks of life into instruments of targeted extinction. The humans hadn't just declared war on the Galactic Council, they had declared war on the very concept of alien life in the universe. For the first time in galactic history, an entire civilization was learning what it felt like to face their own evolutionary extinction. The blue marble that had once been humanity's home now looked like a diseased eye staring out into space. Earth's continents were scarred with radioactive craters where major cities had once stood. The oceans glowed with an unnatural phosphorescence from the biological weapons that had contaminated the water supply. Entire mountain ranges had been melted into glass by alien energy weapons, and the planet's atmosphere flickered with radiation storms that would make the surface uninhabitable for generations. But floating in the space around that, devastated world were the broken remains of 10,000 alien warships, their hulls cracked open like discarded shells. The mighty Galactic Council armada that had arrived with such confidence now existed only as debris fields stretching from Mercury to Jupiter. 47 species that had ruled the galaxy for millennia had been reduced to scattered refugees hiding in the outer darkness, afraid to show themselves to the monsters they had awakened. Admiral Hannah Kim sat in her command bunker 3 miles beneath the surface of Luna, Earth's moon. The facility had been designed to survive anything short of a direct hit from a planet-killer weapon. Its walls lined with enough lead and titanium to stop radiation that could melt steel. Through her reinforced windows, she could see Earth hanging in space like a warning to the galaxy. This is what happens when you threaten humanity. Her voice reached every surviving alien in the solar system when she activated the fleet-wide communication system. "Survivors of the Galactic Council," she began, her words carrying the weight of absolute victory achieved through absolute sacrifice. "You came here because you feared what humanity might become if left unchecked. I want you to understand that your fear was completely justified." The few remaining council leaders had gathered on the bridge of their last surviving command ship, a battered vessel that looked like it had been chewed up by some enormous predator. Among them stood what remained of Velthar, the crystalline being who had delivered the original ultimatum. Half of his body had been shattered by human biological weapons. His perfect crystal form now held together by emergency medical equipment that barely kept him alive. They had come to negotiate surrender, but Kim's terms were not negotiations. They were ultimatums delivered by the victors to the defeated. Complete withdrawal from all human-claimed territory, full reparations for the reconstruction of Earth and its colonies, and most importantly, formal acknowledgement that humanity now held dominant military power in the galaxy. Captain Young-ho. Sim commanded what remained of Earth's fleet from the bridge of a heavily damaged cruiser. Of the 200 ships that had started the war, only 53 were still operational. His crew was exhausted, running on emergency rations and recycled air, but they faced no opposition. The Council's military might have been completely shattered by tactics that no civilized species had ever imagined. Suicide attacks that turned death into victory, swarm warfare that overwhelmed defenses through sheer numbers, and biological weapons that attacked evolution itself. Dr. Min-Soo An worked from his mobile laboratory aboard one of the surviving human vessels, documenting the scope of destruction with scientific precision. His reports would become the foundation for humanity's new position in galactic politics, proof of what happened to species that threatened Earth's survival. 47 different alien civilizations had been reduced to tiny fractions of their original populations. Their homeworlds bore scars that would last for geological ages. Their military fleets had been not just defeated, but completely annihilated. The survivors now competed desperately for human favor, offering their most advanced technologies in exchange for protection from the chaos their own failed invasion had created. Species that had considered themselves the galaxy's natural rulers now begged for the privilege of serving humanity's interests. They had learned that threatening Earth didn't just risk military defeat, it risked complete evolutionary extinction. The war was over, but its lessons would echo throughout the galaxy for millions of years. Humanity had proven that when pushed to the brink of extinction, they would not only fight back, but would ensure their enemies regretted ever being born. The galaxy's most civilized species had awakened something far more dangerous than they could have imagined, and now they would live with the consequences of that mistake for the rest of their existence. In the ruins of Earth, among the radioactive ashes of humanity's greatest cities, a new chapter in galactic history had begun. 5 years had passed since the last council ship had limped away from Earth's solar system, and the galaxy had learned to live in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of diplomacy and cooperation that had existed before. It was the terrified hush of prey animals trying not to attract the attention of an apex predator. Luna, Earth's scarred moon, had become the beating heart of humanity's new empire. The sprawling complex of government buildings, military installations, and research facilities stretched across the lunar surface like a metal spiderweb, connected by pressurized tunnels and transport tubes. At its center stood the most important building in galactic politics, the Hall of Judgment, where humanity's new ruler held court over the remnants of 47 broken civilizations. Admiral Hannah Kim had traded her military uniform for the robes of Earth's first galactic governor, though the title was largely ceremonial. Everyone in the galaxy knew that her real authority came from the memory of what humanity could do when threatened. She sat on a throne carved from the crystalline remains of Velthar's homeworld, each facet reflecting the faces of the alien leaders who knelt before her in submission. The reformed Galactic Council was a shadow of its former self. Where once proud ambassadors had stood as equals, now frightened survivors begged for the right to continue existing. They brought tribute, in the form of advanced technology, scientific knowledge and labor crews, to help rebuild the world they had tried to destroy. 5 years ago, you came to eliminate humanity because you feared what we might become. Kim addressed the assembly, her voice echoing through the crystalline chamber. You were right to be afraid, but you misunderstood the nature of the threat. What you feared was our potential for violence. What you face now is violence perfected and turned into policy. The alien representatives trembled as she spoke. They had all seen the reports from their homeworlds, the documentation of what human forces could accomplish when properly motivated. Cities reduced to ash, populations decimated by biological weapons, military fleets that had ruled space for thousands of years turned into drifting scrap metal by pilots willing to die for their kills. Down on Earth's slowly healing surface, Colonel Jinwoo Ro supervised the reconstruction efforts with the efficiency of a man who had spent years planning. The destruction of alien worlds. The planet's new cities were rising from the radioactive ashes of the old ones, but they were different now. Built with alien technology and powered by energy sources that the Council had considered too dangerous for primitive species to possess, they stood as monuments to humanity's transformation from victims to victors. Alien work crews labored under human supervision, their former masters now reduced to providing manual labor for the species they had tried to exterminate. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Beings who had considered themselves too civilized for physical work now toiled to rebuild the world they had helped to destroy. Dr. Sola Choi continued her research in laboratories that made her wartime facilities look primitive by comparison. Her biological weapons had evolved beyond simple killing tools into instruments of absolute control. Every species in the galaxy now carried genetic markers that made them vulnerable to human-designed pathogens. It was insurance against future rebellion, a biological leash that could be activated if any species ever again threatened humanity's dominance. Her weekly reports to the Galactic Council served as reminders of what awaited those who opposed Earth's interests. New weapons more precise than ever before, capable of targeting not just species, but specific populations, bloodlines, or even individual genetic markers. The message was clear. Humanity could end any alien civilization with surgical precision. Whenever they chose to do so, the galaxy had learned to live with the knowledge that the monsters from the old stories were real, and they had won. Humanity had evolved from a single world's primitive inhabitants into something far more dangerous, apex predators who had turned warfare itself into an art form. In the end, the Galactic Council had gotten exactly what they deserved for trying. To cage a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of killing. They had awakened something that would rule the galaxy through fear, respect, and the absolute certainty that crossing humanity meant facing extinction. The Age of Galactic. Civilization was over. The age of human dominance had begun.